And let's get started. So hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us to How We Build This webinar series featuring Toronto's most innovative leaders and the story behind the movement they built. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nama Blonder. I'm an architect and urban planner with Smart Density. My co-host and dear friend, Lirad Kligman, the co-founder of the Yorkville team, a residential and commercial sales team in Toronto. So Lirad and I came up with this idea of having this interview series, kind of inspired by How We Build This by Guy Raz, if you're familiar with, and to get an opportunity to ask the leaders of this industry the story about their businesses and how they build it and what inspired them to probably leave a safe job and start their own business. So Lirad, why won't you introduce Norm?
Yep, thank you, Nama. So today we're joined, of course, by Norm Lee. So Norm is the founder and principal of Norm Lee, Canada's leading visual content studio for the architecture, design, and development industries. Equipped with a strong architectural background, Norm's team of artists specialize in providing renderings, animation, photography, video, interactive, and VR solutions. And Norm also has a strong passion for cooking and food. So let's start off with a really essential burning question. Norm, what did you cook last night?
Last night I cooked pork two ways. So I had a roasted Chinese pork and a roasted Jamaican pork.
Sounds delicious.
Yeah, it's fun.
Okay, awesome. Well, thanks for that. So now that that's out of the way, so let's set the stage and go back to the beginning with your background. So you went to the University of Waterloo for architecture, and somewhere along the way you decided you didn't want to be an architect. So what happened there?
that was pretty fast. You know, I always tell people, you know, architecture school is a great education. You know, it's a little bit of science, a little bit of art, it's a little bit of math, it's a little bit of engineering. You know, it's a very well-rounded education. The problem with the profession, though, is you know, it's a very top-down hierarchical sort of situation, and you know, maybe I have a bit of ADD, but you know, I couldn't bear to be on a project for 3 years and have a career that would span, you know, 30, 40 years, where, you know, until the end of it would I, you know, get anywhere. Now, thankfully, that's changing a little bit these days. You know, I see a lot of my colleagues in my cohort now reaching a principal stage at the age of 40. I think that's a positive change to see. But just, you know, when I was in school and I think it was 22 when I made the decision, I couldn't deal with the life that I saw ahead of me.
For sure, yeah. Okay, and then so you started normally fairly early on, and back then Toronto, in terms of sales and marketing, the rendering industry was not nearly as developed and sophisticated as it was today. So what was your thought process for identifying that need, that demand in the business, and how did you decide, let's start this up?
So it was actually like, it's kind of like the story of my life, sort of bumbled into it, you know, like I'd be lying if I said there was any kind of plan or any kind of genius behind it. It's, you know, it was all sort of circumstances and taking the opportunities that were put in front of me and running with it. So when I was in school, I had learned to do a little bit of 3D rendering, and I had a co-op job at a hospital where, quite frankly, there wasn't a whole lot for me to do. And so they sort of just let me do whatever I wanted. And I just spent a lot of time doing 3D. And I took another job after that in a follow-up co-op term, which was actually in a rendering studio. And I mistakenly landed the job. So, you know, in the interview, they're like, do you know how to use Max? And I was like, yes, of course. It's a famous story now. Like, I tell this all the time. Well, it's not a famous story, but I tell this story a lot. So in the interview, they go, do you know how to use Max? And I go, of course I know how to use Max. I have apples in the lab at school and I use them all the time. And so interview goes fine. And they hire me and I get to the job the first day and they're like, okay, here's your computer. I'm like, where are the Macs? And they're like, oh no, no, Max is a software program. And so the first 3 weeks of that job, I had to learn how to use 3D Studio Max, which is what they were talking about, whereas I was talking about how the computers. And so that was how I got my first job seriously in the industry. But the point of that story is that, like, even though there was this huge fuck up and this huge sort of potential catastrophe, I just sort of dug in and just sort of in 3 weeks taught myself, along with the help of, the studio manager, how to use the software. And, it turned out quite well. And, from there, there was various staffing changes, and I ended up running the studio. And I actually dropped out of school. So that was on a co-op term. And so I went to work in New York for a bit, and I did some more 3D rendering in New York. And then I came back, and I was like 4 months shy of my degree. And I was totally over working in architecture. I'd spent 8 months in New York working 100-hour weeks, sleeping under my desk and eating takeout every day of the week, 7 days a week. And I was like, okay, I can't do this anymore. So, my boss at the time at that job called me. He's like, I got a position for you. Would you like to come and run the studio? And it was 4 months shy of my degree, right? Like another 4 months, and I would have been done, right? And I just packed it all in, and I went and worked there and learned, like, again, it's another, just bumbling around, right? Like I didn't really have a plan. I just sort of went with what was in my gut and just sort of said, okay, I'll take this job. And that kind of went to shit. But what was great about it was that I learned how to run a business, because basically the boss at the time, he fucked off, right? Like basically, I was doing good work. I think I can objectively say that I was doing really great work, and I was basically doing all the work. I was running the studio. I was the only employee. I was running the whole damn thing myself, and I was doing all the work. And so the boss felt like it was fine for him to just, travel wherever he wanted, basically be on vacation 12 months a year. At the end of 12 months, being paid $28,000. That's always what I remember the most. This 2001, 2003 at this point. 2003, I was making $28,000 a year. Even back then, that was nothing, right? Like, I mean, like I had to live at home and but after a year of running the business, I figured out that the business was probably generating about $400,000 a year, and I was being paid $28,000 a year. So we had a falling out, and I was like, fuck off. And I actually didn't intend to start my own business after that either. What basically happened was, so I quit the job in a fit of rage. And then I went and I was looking for other jobs, but there just weren't that many studios at the time. So, I had no safety net. Like I had nothing I could fall back on. I quit my job. I didn't have a degree. I didn't have any real skills in architecture. So I was kind of fucked, right? So I couldn't do much else. Like I basically, I was lucky enough that a few of my clients actually called me and were like, where the fuck do you go? Like, what, like, we're calling the office, you're not there. Your boss says you're not there. Like, where are you? They're so used to working with me, like they're hunting me down. And so, I was lucky enough to land some work that way, and then it just sort of snowballed.
Okay, interesting. I wanted to ask you how you got the first client. Now you tell us about the early days and what led up to what you consider to be your first biggest success that you said that was a turning point in my business.
I think, I worked in my basement by myself for 5 years. I worked in my basement just continuously, 20 hours a day, 7 days a week. And then the turning point would have to be, I made the decision to hire my first team member, right? So I hired this guy, Yusuf, and Yusuf ended up sticking around for about 12 years. And I think that's the thing, right? Is that, especially in a creative field like ours, you can't work in a vacuum. Like it just doesn't work. You need a person to bounce your ideas off of. And I will say this all day, Yusuf was a far better artist and creative than I was, especially on the technical side. He was very up to date on software and had a very analytical mind. He came from a computer science background, mixed with architecture. And so he actually accelerated the business because I was doing good work. It was all right, but it wasn't great. It was just that I was cheap and I was fast. But I couldn't hang, my hat on that all day long. Like at some point, the competition was getting stiff. And so Yusuf, enabled us to take a step up. And then after Yusuf, we hired Shelton. And then after Shelton, we hired Brian. And then, on and on and on. And it was just a matter of hiring talented people around me that were, and I didn't necessarily intend to hire people that were smarter or brighter than I was. Just how it turned out. I didn't have anything against it, so that was I think a good thing. You know, like a lot of people, you know, I say to people all the time, you know, the first person you hire should be someone smarter and better than you are at your job, because your job is not to work in the business, to work on the business. So if you hire, like,
and that's a very good point. Can you
so
tell
if you
us
hire
how
a junior,
balance,
yeah.
how you balance business development and day-to-day work in the early days?
Yeah, well, the early days was, you know, I had all the relationships, right? So I would maintain the relationships, and there was no balance in the early days, right? Like anytime you start up a business, I think people have to be prepared for this, is that when you start a business, it's all in. Like it's literally all in. You know this. I mean, like it's, you know, you go out and you get work and you do it, and you live and die by your last job. So you put it, and I think that's part of the problem of architecture school, is that we're not taught how to run a business, but you are definitely taught this all-in attitude, right? Because we just sort of work and work and work until the deadline comes up. So, you know, running your own business and going to architecture school are the sort of worst combination possible in life, because you basically, you know, it's like filling out a timesheet, right? Like if you're an architect, how many architects actually fill out the timesheet properly? We all just put in 8s, right? Like we don't put in, you know, 4.5 or 12 or 13. We all put in 8 because we don't get overtime. So, you know, there's no sense of, you know, how much is actually taking time. So, but yeah, so in the early days, it was all in. Like we all worked mad hours, and we all worked crazy hours, and we all partied like crazy to blow off steam. And that's how it was. And back then it wasn't difficult, you know, because this is like 2003, 2004 we're talking about. So that's 16 years ago.
Can you identify what is the profile of your first clientele, the first people you worked for?
It was all architects. It was all architects, because I came from architecture
background. You worked for architects, not for developers.
Yeah. So my first architect, my first client, my first proper client was Montgomery Seisman. So Terry Montgomery and David Seisman, and I worked with them for about 6 months, and I kept working with them for like another good 5 or 6 years. And then Bruce Gobar called. Actually, Bruce Gobar actually called before that. But, you know, and then the word just started getting out. You know, I had a lot of friends working in architecture firms. There's only 3 studios at the time that did what we did. And it was relatively expensive to do what we did back then as well. But I had the advantage of the fact that I was working in a basement by myself, right? So basically every dollar that I made, I was like, great, you know? So like I charged way less than my competitors, which in hindsight was a terrible, terrible idea.
Right. So at what point did it evolve to become more of a premium service, like good quality and sort of that niche premium brand start to develop?
And this question about that, about Lirad's question, how do you transition from, you know, being the cheapest to being the most expensive?
Yeah, that's a really hard one, because we are the most expensive now. And it's a struggle every day, right? Because there's the battle between the entrepreneur, right? The owner and the entrepreneur, and the team. So of course the team doesn't want to do shit work all day, right? The team wants to do good work. And I've been blessed that, you know, much like when I began, I was surrounded by really good people. I'm still surrounded by great people to this day. But I gotta tell you, you know, the business has been around for, you know, better part of 15, 16 years now. And it's only recently in the last few years that we've shifted into a higher quality mode. And it's not because we didn't want to, it's because you're saddled with the baggage of, and I think this is something that architects really need to consider, and architects really need to hear and discuss amongst themselves, is that, you know, going out and getting work, that's one thing. You know, and so we're always in competition, and we always feel like, you know, the easiest way to get the job is to cut our fees or to offer faster service or whatever. It's taken me the better part of 15 years to overcome that legacy. You know, it really did, it built my profile, sure. But I would say that if I had to go back and do it all over again, I probably would have chosen a higher price point and a higher quality model from the start. Right? Because once you set your fees, people expect escalations of, between 3 and 5% a year. So you do the compounding, right? So if I was charging $1,500 a piece when I first started, and we're charging about 5,000 now, right? We actually took leaps and bounds. Like we're not even anywhere close to where we would be if we had just straight compounded 3 to 5%. And you just can't run a business on those fees, right? So it was, I think the turning point for us was like, what happened was basically, I almost went bankrupt. I didn't have a choice, right? Like, I mean, we were doing great work. We were at the top of our game. We were literally eating everyone's lunch, but we weren't making any money. We were losing significant sums of money. And we're like, how the fuck is this possible? We're doing all this work, we're at the top of our game, but we're losing money and significant sums of money. And we realized, like, we're just straight up not charging enough. And I personally had made all these excuses. This is what the market will bear. This is what our clients are used to paying. We can't charge anymore. But at the end of the day, like, had I kept going, the business wouldn't be here today. And so we basically made a clear and calculated decision. We said, we have to raise our prices 50% year over year. So we were charging 3,000. We said, we have to get to a minimum of 4,500, preferably 48 to 5,000. And people are like, wow, you raise your prices 50% year over year. I'm not stuffing hundos in my pockets, right? Like I'm not like a gazillionaire from it. In fact, it's just catching us up to where we need to be. And I think you and I have had this conversation, Alma, about how they don't talk about business in architecture school. And boy,
no, we don't.
I wish, they had taught business back in architecture school, because I've gone through a lot of bullshit that could have been easily rectified if I had had some business lessons.
Give me one example of another bullshit you had to go through. Teaching it in school might have saved you some time and pain.
Well, again, it's like, in architecture school, they teach you inadvertently that pirating software is okay. Okay, right? Like, I mean, we all go through architecture school. You can't work in the lab all day, right? So like, there's this culture in architecture school where everyone's got a cracked copy of 3ds Max or AutoCAD or whatever software it is you're using. So we all grow up in this culture of pirating software. We go on the torrents, we get the software, blah, blah, blah. Well, we grew to be the largest studio in Canada. At one point, we had 43 employees. So we went from 22 to 43 employees in the span of 6 months. Imagine that. Like, you double the size of your studio in 6 months. Actually, it might have been less than 6 months, maybe like three months. And so then I get this call from the largest reseller of software for our industry in Canada. And friendly call, right? And they're like, it's funny, like, you're doing all this work and you've just never been on our radar. It was kind of a nudge, wink, wink, right? I'm coming to your studio, I see 43 people and they've got the database. They know we've only got 6 licenses for like 43 people, right? And on that day, my software expenses went from 0, because we had perpetual licenses, to I think it was like $60,000 or $70,000 a year. Right? Oh, by the way, my rent had just gone from $2,000 to $22,000 a month. So it's really about running your business as a business, or knowing the escalations and the steps that you have to take as you grow your business, right? Because you can't grow your business and run it like you would a 2-man operation when you're 43 people. So that was another bullshit moment, right? It's like, you've gone along just sort of not paying for anything, right? Like I think for 43 people, we had like 1 phone, right? So, now we get this phone system that's like, $1,500 a month. And, oh, by the way, the internet went from being free at the old office to another $1,000 a month for the internet, right? So it's all these escalations as you're growing a business that if you're not looking in your rearview mirror, you're not looking, in your blind spots, you don't see these things creeping up on you. And like, that's the thing, right? Before we moved into the office, of course we were doing okay at $3,000, because we weren't paying all these expenses. We weren't paying for a properly sized office. We weren't paying for software. We weren't paying for our telecommunications. We weren't paying for what I would consider like top flight benefits, right? Because like, that's part of your recruitment package. No one's going to go work for a large company, or we're not a large company, but I mean a decent sized company that doesn't at least offer health benefits, right? So we spend like I think $400 or $500 a month on just our end of the benefits. So there's all these things from a business perspective that I wish, architecture schools would teach.
I want to ask a question about how you stay ahead of trends. So you're a pretty early adopter of virtual reality technology, and that's still being adopted very much in the sales and marketing side of development. But how do you keep yourself abreast and stay?
You just read a lot. You just have to read a lot, right? And I think the other thing is, and I learned this very, very early on, is that it's important to read between the lines, right? So it's kind of like rendering. We say to people all the time, when you're rendering, it's this mental catalog of stuff. So you go, you walk out in the street and you just sort of look at buildings, you look at architecture, and you take these mental bits of memory and you just store them away in your head. And, for instance, we've got this thing coming up, and I'm not going to talk too much about it, but, it was just basically me, like, watching all my friends doing other shit. I'm like, oh, we could really do that in real estate and development, and it'd be really cool. So taking inspiration from, I think, you're probably less prone to this because you're in sales. So like you guys have a naturally sort of, wide sort of sphere. Nama, you'll know this. It's like going to a party with architects, right? You know who the architects are because A, they all wear black, and B, they're all huddled in a circle facing inwards. So architects have this tendency to be very sort of inward facing and sort of very sort of incestuous and just sort of, like we're in our own little world. And to stay abreast of everything, you really have to look outside of that world. And I think, there's a few people that do it quite well in our world, but I mean, for the most part, architecture is self-reinforcing. So you have to, actively seek out outside input.
I want to talk about the elephant in the room, and is that you run a very, very competitive business. And every business is competitive. Architecture industry is it's not easy. But not only that you compete with local talent, I bet anyone would say, oh, I'll just send it to, the Far East.
Yeah.
How do you run a business that, in such a competitive industry?
Two things, it's always about relationships. And it's always about process. I think quality is subjective, comes down to people's preference. But I always say that the quality of your work, and this could be renderings, this could be architecture, this could be anything, is always shaded by the experience that your clients have, right? So, someone may look at your image and go, oh, that's not that great an image, but your client will love that image and fight to the death for it, for it being top notch and the best in the world, because you have delivered it in a way that has made them feel good. And by making them feel good, I don't mean like kissing their ass, right? I don't mean like, blowing sunshine up their ass and shooting rainbows and unicorns all day long. What I mean is, you have to make their lives easier, right? Like your clients pay you a decent amount of money to do your job. Hopefully, right? If not, you should be doing the job. But they're paying you a fair sum of money to do your job. So it is your responsibility to make that process as easy and as seamless as possible for them. Now, that's sort of what I sort of work on the most. I will admit we're not always perfect at it, but for the most part, I work on building and maintaining strong relationships. And when shit goes sideways, you have to own it and fix it immediately. And then there's always, the idea of tribes, right? Like, I mean, you're not meant to work with everyone. If someone is dead set on sending something to China because it's cheaper and faster, and they're okay with the product, then they're obviously not the kind of people that should be working with us. Not because they're bad people, but just because our points of view would not necessarily come together. They have a different set of values than we do. And that's a big thing, is that, we've established what our values are as a team and as a company. And when things go sideways, I mean, we look at our values and we say, did we fuck up here? Or is this just a simple mismatch of values? And, 7 to 8 times out of 10, it's, yes, there's some bullshit in the background, but it's typically rooted in a mismatch of values.
if you look back at the past 15 to 20 years, if there's one thing that you could do differently, just hindsight is 2020.
Yeah.
What would that be?
Oh, charge more. Like, charge more from the beginning, and don't back down, right? Like, I always tell people, what's the difference between one $5,000 job and five $1,000 jobs? It's 5 times the amount of work to do five $1,000 jobs. The money's the same. So if you could charge $5,000 for one job and pour your heart into one job at $5,000 versus spreading yourself thin over 5 jobs at $1,000 each, of course you're going to do better work for the $5,000 fee. And that's sort of self-reinforcing, right? So then it's just a hamster wheel. You do great work, someone else sees your work, they love it, and they pay you $5,000 again. And your work just is good and it gets better, right? And then eventually your work is good and then you charge more, right? So especially at, at $1,000, you compound that, right? At 3 to 5% a year, it's $30 to $50 increase a year, right? Versus $5,000, which is a $150 to $250 increase a year. So after 4 years, you're at $6,000. At $1,000 after 4 years, you're maybe at $1,200, right? So you can see how those lines just sort of diverge.
For sure.
And how that affects your career trajectory further down the road. At the end of the day, from a business perspective, you have to build a healthy business and it has to be profitable. I think I learned that way too late. Coming from architecture school, part of it was about the passion of doing the work. Part of it was about the pursuit. Part of it was like, the fact that I had no safety net. So I was like, always like, whatever, even if we lose money on the job, like, it's revenue. What you realize further down the road, so that was 23 and I'm 42 now, turning 43 this year, so 20 years ago. So now I'm at the back half of my career. Hopefully I still have a long time, but closer to the back end of my career than the front end. And so what I'm thinking about now is, how do I exit this business? Right? I fully believe this business will live on beyond me. The name will live on beyond me. It might change names, but the business itself will keep going. But in order for that to happen, I have to exit the business. So in order to exit the business, I have to have a profitable business.
Do you pursue business beyond Toronto, beyond Canada?
Oh, of course, yeah. Like
where and how?
It's really funny. So in a world of digital marketing, we find analog marketing works really well. Just either sending books. We make these beautiful sort of coffee table books that we send around the world, or going to different cities and knocking on doors. Like when you reach a certain size and certain scale, you just go knock on doors. Like I have the luxury.
How do you narrow down the entire world to the cities you want to work and knock on doors in those cities? It's quite a bit.
Well, we look at cities that have a certain critical mass in terms of business. So it's really funny, like people would be like, oh, why don't you go work in New York, or go work in Dubai, or go work in London? It's actually a really tough thing right now, because for us, in a rendering perspective, there's more work here in Toronto than I think, the rest of the world combined, probably. Like, I'm exaggerating to some degree, but there is. I mean, Toronto is the new Dubai. Toronto is like I mean, both architecture and volume, right? Like, I mean, it's we're very fortunate to be situated here. And,
can you? Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I wanted to ask actually about, I'm thinking of Toronto. Can you tell us what, in terms of the infrastructure that you have in the business that you built and invested in? So it could be, did you model the entire city? Did you, I don't know, you take aerial shots? Yeah. What are the things that you say, I have a good base and this is why my business is thriving?
I think it's a couple things. So infrastructure, yeah, it's fine. We've done enough projects that, we have a good model of the city and we have lots of buildings and all that, right? And I go up in a helicopter, I take pictures of the city. I think the thing that is most critical to infrastructure of a business is two things. At a practical level, it's knowledge of the city and knowledge of the market. So when I go into a conversation with a developer or an architect, you know, we don't speak from just a rendering perspective. We don't just talk about the mechanics of rendering. You know, we often dive into the market and how it's performing, or specific neighborhoods and the demographics of those neighborhoods and the type of buyers that they're trying to attract, and you know, at what point of gentrification or whatever you want to use the term is, you know, is that neighborhood in, right? Because let's be honest, all neighborhoods in Toronto are in some form of gentrification. They're in some form of transition, right? And so, especially when a developer chooses to go in, you know, like if you look at where a lot of people are looking now, which is, you know, Danforth and Maine, right? So, you know, putting condos over a parking lot right by the GO station, you know, traditionally a blue collar neighborhood. I grew up on the East End, so, you know, I know that neighborhood is like, it's all right, it's not horrible, but it's not, you know, kind of place where you're going to typically attract, you know, professional white collar families to go live. So how do you tell that story, and you know, what's the price point? Like, you know, having that ability to speak beyond just rendering and really talk about market dynamics and demographics and development and urban planning and design, that's the real critical infrastructure. And we try to instill that in our team, so it goes beyond just me. But I think that's the most important part, because you can be the best at drawings, you can be the best at rendering, you can be the best at designing, but if your rendering and your design are out of context within the particular situation within which it's used, it's meaningless.
You know what, we have time for my last question and then Lirad's last question. Did you have a mentor, someone who, you know, you reached out to, and, you know, when you were about to on the verge of bankruptcy, and someone who helped you figure out your business?
So I didn't have a mentor coming up through this, and I think that's also something that I would highly recommend to people, is that, you know, I think it's if you look through time, like, so there's this really poorly named book, it's called Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. And Think and Grow Rich is not about getting rich, right? It's about time-tested ways of conducting business. And I read that actually quite late in my career. And it's really funny because by then I had already done all these things that are suggested. But one of the things that, you know, is recommended in the book is, you know, and this is, I think the book was like 18 something or like very early 1900s. And they coined this term mastermind group, right? Which is kind of what you're trying to do here. And I think is very au courant, and everyone's trying to do it at this moment. But there have been mastermind groups, which
we're obviously the best.
Yes, you're the best. But in business circles, they're called peer-to-peer networks.
Yeah.
Okay, so, you know, I'm a member of tech. You know, there's YPO, there's EO, there's all kinds of peer-to-peer groups out there. And yet, it's kind of like, you know, picking a sports team, right? You got to pick the one that, you know, you would identify with most. But what's great about these groups, and they exist all over the place, they're kind of expensive, I'm not going to lie. Like I pay $1,500 a month in membership dues for mine, which is a lot, right? Like, I mean, that's a lot. It's like what? That's $15,000, $20,000 a year after taxes. But what you do get from that is, you know, you get someone that you could call a mentor or coach, but you also meet with similar or higher ranking level executives from all kinds of industries on a monthly basis. And I think that's been really great and really helpful, is that I've seen other people go through struggles. They've seen me go through my struggle. They've helped while I've gone through my struggle. So yes, I did have a coach. I did have a mentor, but I also had this support network of a bunch of people who we hold everyone's information in strict confidence, and we share everything in a very transparent manner. I think that's the other thing too. You know, a lot of people are like, oh, you're so transparent, you know, you don't leave anything, you know, to the imagination, you're all out with it. Well, if you want people to help you, or you want people to collaborate with you, I think, you know, that's the only way to be. If you're transparent and you share everything, you get the best results. So to answer your question, yes, I did have a coach. I did have a support group, and it came in the form of a peer-to-peer network, and I highly recommend it to anyone who's in business or going into business.
Great. And my last question is going more back to the business industry side. where do you see the rendering industry in your business specifically in the next 5 to 10 years? How do you see it evolving in that time?
Yeah, it's funny. It's a question we ask ourselves every day. You know, like, you know, Nama, you hinted to earlier, it's a very competitive space. You know, our whole thing right now is that I think there is a core thread throughout the history of our business of storytelling. You know, so what we do is we tell stories, whether it's through renderings, whether it's through animations, whether it's through interactive, we tell stories. And we tell stories to an architectural or design minded audience. And that's kind of what we're looking at right now, is how do we evolve the business? And I think, you know, you're going to see the idea of rendering take many different shapes and forms. You know, look at any movie now, right? Like, I mean, you go watch The Lion King, the latest Lion King, right? Like, I just watched it for the first time with my kids, and I'm like, holy shit, right? Like, you know, here's a bunch of animals that, like, because I'm in the business, there's moments where, you know, like, oh, that's CG. But for the most part, you know, you're looking at this thing and you get immersed in it, and you're just like, oh, like, these animals are so talented. Like, they're talking, right? Like, but, you know, the barriers to photorealism and that type of qualification is dropping every day. But what is not in great supply is good storytelling and good process and good relationships, right? That's still very sort of rarefied, and that's what people are willing to pay for. So renderings, that will become a byproduct, and that will become a sort of result of what we do, versus right now, which is, it's a core element of what we do. And I think the shift will sort of move more towards experiences, for lack of a better description, so that, you know, in a sales environment, instead of just looking at a building sort of passively, right? Because it's a very passive experience. You know, you're sort of just taking in materials. It's more of a journey. It's more of an experience. Like, you're guided through this experience, so that hopefully by the time you come out on the other end, you're just like, where's the APS, right? So, yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, that takes us right to the end. So thank you very much, Norm. It was very informative and insightful. Appreciate you sharing your experiences. Yeah. And I know that our attendees got a lot of value out of this.
Awesome.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And we're going to, Nama, do you want to give a little tip on the next episode?
Next week we have, we're going to have Jane Farrow. Honestly, we had a quick conversation with her yesterday. It's going to be fascinating from, you know, being the bridge between developers and the community. I really encourage you all to register. And with that, Norm, thank you. It was, I personally am so happy that we had that conversation, and I'm glad that, you know, we had dozens of people joining us. So thank you. Have a beautiful rest of the day, everyone, and see you next week. Bye.
Okay. Bye, guys.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.